very happy to be here today, and I look forward to the coming 2 days because I'm sure we'll be able to share and learn a lot from each other. So I have been asked to talk about Industry 4.0, and I think it's a nice concept in the realm of the complexity of the world. Because of course this is kind of, you could see it as an industry issue, but it's actually a broad societal and economic issue for the future, as we will be seeing. Very happy to see a lot of familiar faces here in the room also. So this outcome is actually, this was actually a contribution to the European Commission's Horizon 2020 project, in which we looked at how Foresight could actually help kind of provide some of the content to the framework programs that were going on there. And there's a number of people in the room here also that were with me on that expert committee. So what are we talking about actually when we talk about Industry 4.0? It's really the widespread adoption of a whole set of technologies being actually now implemented. So we're talking about different technologies like artificial intelligence, robots. We're talking about nanotechnology, virtual reality, the Internet of Things, biotech, big data, simulation, cloud computing, additive manufacturing or D3 printing. So all of these different technologies kind of exist since quite some time, but what is coming up now is a revolution in terms of its adaptation, adaptability, and usage within the industry. And this is what we're saying if we do a bit of forward thinking about how might that actually change manufacturing. This is what we talk about, and that's what we call, there is a new production paradigm coming up, in which machines, the virtual world, but also the humans, are going to start to be integrated and connected to produce things that will be consumed. So what will this really change? There's a lot of theories about this, obviously, but in essence I see 4 big categories where change will happen in the production systems. The first one is really on the floor, kind of in the manufacturing areas. So what we call there is, we say, well, these new production systems are going to be full with cyber-physical production systems. So we will see that production becomes a lot more autonomous, less need for people. We will always know where resources, including human resources, and products are located anytime. There is great tracking possible. We will very easily be able to see where demand is and react extremely quickly to this. And we will finally get to this world that we've been talking about since a whole long time, which is the customized, individualized consumption of products that are being produced on demand. What this will mean also is that there will be a requirement for a whole lot new skills. And I think what we will also start seeing is something a bit more new, is that I think it will also, through wearable technologies, etc., make that we are going to control and monitor the workers on the floor a lot more. As a second change in production that we will see in the future then, is not only at the level of one unity, but is at the level of the value chains. We can imagine that in the future, all these different production sites are connected a lot stronger, which might be leading to vertical and horizontal integration of production systems. And I will come back, I'm just pointing out the key changes because we'll come at the end to policy making and what it means for policy making, and these are really key changes as it relates to policy. A third change we'll see is that we will suddenly have these vast amounts of data that are being produced. Given everything is tracked, all processes are digitalized, consumer preferences are recorded and are analyzed and are used. We will see suddenly massive amounts of data, including information about consumers, a lot more. And a fourth big change that will happen is that nothing happens in isolation, obviously. So the manufacturing will change, but in some kind of way it will interact with other smart ecosystems. For example, if we think about drones and autonomous vehicles and sensors around infrastructure like roads, you can start to see how this can also start to optimize or create some challenges on the way goods are being produced and delivered. So quite a lot of change coming up, and when you, and I have just switched this up, yeah. However, this is kind of the general narrative that you constantly hear. You constantly hear there's all these technologies, it's all gonna change everything, and we're gonna get more efficient, and it's gonna be to the benefit of absolutely everyone, and it's gonna create great economic growth, and it's fantastic, right? That's the current narrative that you're hearing. Take any type of consulting firm report, and that's what you will read. However, there's that great progress is tabled on quite a number of critical assumptions that I think as forward-looking people we should kind of investigate whether this world is really if really this new production paradigm will come up as fast as it is coming up set to be. So the first critical assumption is that these technologies are actually first mature, they're economically viable, so it's worthwhile investing in them from a business perspective. And one important aspect, I think, which is very often overlooked, is whether they are socially acceptable. It is not because a technology is available that it will be implemented and that it will be accepted throughout society. We can think about robots here, for example. A second very important aspect is all this transformation to get to this new production paradigm requires a huge amount of investment. Just think about like one production site, how much investment it needs to actually become an Industry 4.0 type of manufacturing plant. We will have a great need for skilled and educated workers with different skills who can design, operate, and manage those very complex production systems. Ultimately, the fourth one is something we take very much for granted, having access to a reliable digital communication system, kind of the internet working all the time perfectly smoothly. I come from Geneva. It's not even the case there all the time on my mobile. So a fourth base assumption for all this to happen is that we will at some point agree on standards. All this is based on data, on new production schemes, so which kind of data platform and standards are actually going to drive this, and how are we going to make sure that internationally we agree on these type of things in the type of world we're living now. Then there will be a big question around ownership and access to all of this data. It's not worked on for the moment. Another assumption is that intellectual property rights around all these new digital assets, digital templates, all of this will be regulated and will all be protected. And then there is another assumption which says that in this new world of Industry 4.0, it will always be better, economically better, to have robots rather than workers. It will economically always outweigh to have robots rather than humans. So there's all these assumptions actually that if you look at them, you can start to question whether this Industry 4.0 is just miraculously going to change production in the coming 10 years. But as we know with technology, usually it doesn't happen as fast as we predict it to be, as we expect it to be. But ultimately, in the long run, it might have a lot more consequences and more unintended consequences. But it actually happens. So it's worthwhile starting to think about it. We see in reality, we start to see kind of manufacturing plants and value chains that are slowly starting to move there. Will it go fast or not? It will depend on a lot of those factors. Now, where we are interested in this is not just from a business perspective. So what we were looking at is at this assumption that it will provide a lot of economic growth. So it is estimated that because you will have all these new services, all these new products being created, that this will drive the innovation again. This will drive economic growth for the countries that are really stepping into this, and that it can kind of set economies back on track. A second aspect of economic growth we were looking at is that actually because of the Industry 4.0 paradigm, there might be a lot of production being re-insourced, if you stand in Europe, that a lot of production might actually come back from countries which are now having a comparative advantage, either because of their resources or because of their low labor costs. So with automation, for example, those advantages of low labor costs are not that important anymore. Like robots in France are as easy on social security systems as they are in China. So by consequence, you could see for these reasons some of the markets coming back of production. But you could also look at that from an energy perspective, for example, as we start to be more resilient and more secure on our own production of resources and of energy and of water. Actually, economically, it might start to become viable to bring a lot of that production back. So great for the economy, a lot of social economic challenges to be managed. So that's why we were looking at this topic. We were providing advice to the European Commission, but I think it works. It would be good for every country who wants to innovate and start to look at that for its own economic growth, to look at some of those policy areas that need to be further developed. So in essence, there's 10 policy areas that we identified that have to be considered to properly manage the balance between economic growth and the social challenges that come with it. The first one is really competitive markets. One of the main issues here is everyone says, okay, with all these technologies, we all have access to these technologies. It will bring in a lot of new players into the production ecosystems. People will be able to co-create. You will have small firms, SMEs. Everyone can have access now to this the new production economy because technology creates these low barriers. We can have the education in it, etc., etc. So fantastic. On the other side, that's kind of the main discourse we always hear, right? This is the official future that you're constantly hearing, at least in policy areas. We have to promote all this because this is going to be fantastic to bring all these different actors within this ecosystem. Now, the reality of things is that these technologies are expensive. They're very hard to bring into reality. And so there is a real risk, actually, that some of those technologies can only be implemented by the big groups, so the ones with the deep pockets, so which means that you might have a high risk, actually, of consolidation over the value chain and of monopolization of certain markets. Because if you're capable of implementing those technologies, especially the data technologies, what you get access to is a whole lot of information about your clients, about where supply is. You can become more efficient, you can become more reactive, and by consequence, if you also have the data analytics behind it, you can have a very strong predictive power, as they say, on producing what the market will be demanding and what is wanted. And so by consequence, from a policy perspective, just having the assumption that kind of all this technology and the openness might lead to a world with more actors and more individuals being able to contribute to the economy in the future is a quite dangerous assumption if we do not start to look at kind of how these markets can start to become very quickly monopolized and consolidated. A second area is the trade area. So, as those who work a bit in trade might know, the trade frameworks around anything which is digital and intellectual property, etc., they're not that well developed. There's a lot of discussions around these things. And so what we will see in this world, actually, we will see a lot of new technologies being born. We'll see a lot of products which are supposed to have a lot of intellectual property. We'll see these enhanced machineries. We'll see data analytics software. We'll also see products that are just the outcome of the data analytics, and we see a lot of customized products. For the moment, the agreements around trade for those type of products, they're not really existing. So assuming that we're going to have a global world in which all these value chains are nicely seamlessly to the benefit of everyone, going to be interconnected, and the world will kind of be able to create global growth smoothly from this, is also quite a strong assumption. So there has to be more effort done on the trade frameworks for this new world. Then obviously we already talked about standards. This is a major issue because there's always two issues. Will we have standards to make it happen, and whose standards are these going to be? So there's a lot of discussion around whether those standards will, in certain areas, there's a lot of discussions on will we wait for the Americans or someone to come up with the standards and the world will kind of apply those, or should we be more innovative? Should we make sure that actually to grow Europe and to be strong actually are these kind of standards that we have to develop ourselves? How much do we have to do? How much do we have to adopt? Certainly something to really look into. Data privacy, a big issue, as we know. For the moment, from a policy perspective, where it is important is to really reflect on the protection of data. I don't think that's anything new. We all know that's on the agenda. It is on the agenda to protect the data from companies and from consumers, from society. And I think one big assumption there is also that needs to be looked into further is the fact that for the moment all this data actually by industrial groups, corporations, is being collected from us individuals, and it's become kind of a paradigm that this is kind of for free and they can use this, and we are all kind of fine with giving up all of our data and it being used. And so the model is a bit run around that, but I think in the future, and that's where policy making also needs to come in, I think, is to kind of start to really draw some lines around this. And then the question is, where are the lines between, again, do you go for too much data privacy, which makes that then the industrials cannot really use it to kind of meet our needs? Or do you know, where is the blurring line kind of between providing enough data so that it can be used, but not enough data that it can be misused? And also, if we go to a paradigm where we are no longer willing to give up all our own information for free, if we want to be our own agent of data, how will this work? Right? Will we see some new intermediaries coming up in these value chains? Are certain people going to drive a business model around that? And you know, what is going to happen in that space? Actually, something to very closely look at, I believe. Another area is the intellectual property. Obviously, there the big issues are around the fact that there's this whole assumption that we will be working on in a network-based value chain. Network-based value chain with a lot of different actors means a lot of moving data from one company to another, which is not necessarily part of the same structure. And I know that a lot of companies actually are very wary to do this, because their assumption is that if we, for example, as a producer, provide a lot of information to some of our providers, some of the people who provide us the resources or something, or we provide it down to the next chain of the value chain, while we provide that data that is needed to seamlessly make those value chains nice and smooth, we are giving away, actually, in the data, a lot of our business secrets. If you can actually really look at the data we give, you will understand the way we function. And by consequence, we're not really ready to do that, because we don't know if everything will be kind of protected. And by consequence, we will start to integrate our value chains and go for monopolization and consolidation. A second area there is under the assumption that consumers will be co-creators more and more. We can imagine a future in this type of work where, I always talk about shoes because I love shoes, I'm a woman, but I would want to have a pair of shoes, so I go online somewhere and I take some kind of a template and I start to adapt the color, and I start to adapt kind of how the tips are and the and the heels, etc. So at that point, I'm actually co-creating, right? I am designing a pair of shoes that then someone else, you might come along and think I did a great job, and you want to buy the same one, so you also get them printed close to your place in your 3D shop or something. But whose intellectual properties are my shoes now, right? What have you just bought? Have you bought my design? Have you bought the outcome of kind of this digital template? Or have you bought actually part of it, the creators of the template that I have been using? So there's going to be a lot more intermediary products being developed along the lines of all these value chains. And the question then is, whose intellectual property is this? Who should be compensated for this? And who should get the economic benefits for that? So all new kind of questions. Sustainability. I haven't completely gotten my head around that one, but there is this assumption, and you read about it all the time, is that Industry 4.0 is going to make that we're going to produce more efficiently, have less waste, and we're going to be able to go through to the circular economy because of Industry 4.0. So this is a really great thing. So I think there needs to be a bit of reflection more around that. Is that kind of a guarantee? Will Industry 4.0 and the possibilities of it really lead to a more sustainable world? Or will we, as usually in these type of systems, start to see some unintended consequences that we might not have been thinking about? I think it's something I look forward, if there's any sessions or anyone has like some answers around that, to talk about that. Then there's also a lot of, you could see this still kind of in the taking the opportunity box. There's a lot of challenges to manage when we think about Industry 4.0. The first one being the inclusivity of that economic growth. As we know, it's one thing to grow, and it's fantastic, but there's been, in the recent years, for a number of good reasons, a lot of discussions about whether we shouldn't make the system slightly more inclusive for the long run. And then there are two main aspects, actually. So the first one is, obviously, we will go through a phase where certain resources, human resources, are no longer required, right? At the same time, we will have a lot of growth coming from new types of jobs. Cloud computing did not exist, I think, 10 years ago. It's a billion industry. There's 100,000 of people working in that. So there will be new jobs being created. And actually, where there's two issues, and it's netting out. Will there be more or less jobs in the end? Is a big open question. The current narrative is that net out, there will be less jobs in the world. which creates this idea that we will all be sitting on the beach and have all this great free time, and that we need this minimum income, etc., etc., right? It's never happened in the past, but the future can be different from the past. But netting out is still a question. The second question is then, how will we manage transition? If we have an assumption that we can take kind of the people who are getting out of a job, retrained into kind of new jobs, as we know that all takes time and there will be a transition period to actually be managed. So that's very important. And that has a time delay, obviously. Another question I think is where I don't hear a lot of discussions about is kind of the social contract and how that might change. We have this assumption that all the robots are going to be cheaper than humans, so we will just, kick out the humans, put in the robots, and economically this is a good idea. And so then the government is going to have to deal with all the unemployed people. But in essence, could we see a future in which there starts to be more competition between robots and humans, where humans actually are starting to be willing to give up on a lot of the things that make that they are more expensive? So where are we going with our social security systems? Would people in the end be willing to have a bit less healthcare services, pay a bit more for education, be a bit easier on kind of unemployment benefits, etc., to make sure that you still keep your job? Because a job is not a question just of income. It's, for a lot of people, it's a question of identity, of existing, having some use and contribution in the world, right? I mean, why do we all work? Of course, for the money also, but, that's not the only thing, right? So there's this reflection where in the end is this going to end up? I'm quite fascinated by thinking about that. So again, if anyone has great suggestions, and for the coming day, I would love to talk about that. Are we taking our social structures and our cost structures on human beings and what life is about as we know it too much for granted? Or do we have to look a bit deeper into how reality might play out in the future? A next area where policymakers need to reflect is the Internation Competition and protectionism. We all know, at least in Europe, but a bit across the world, we're going to a more closed world. People are starting to be more resistant to being open, my nation first, my flag first, security in my country first. Now, what we see there is, I could see this like with this Industry 4.0 becoming actually stronger. And we had these discussions around the European Commission and the European Union. Because if we think about the insourcing back of everything which is currently done in India and China and all these countries, and in the north of Africa, a lot of the production is happening there. If a lot of those productions come actually back to Europe, what do we expect European countries to do to compete for those markets, right? I would prefer, if I'm the minister in Belgium, I would obviously prefer like the new production being brought back rather to Belgium than to France. Even if it doesn't create a lot of jobs, it creates other, it creates an ecosystem of production and of utility for people. So I could see that in the future people start to kind of play with their fiscal and social security policies, on which there's not that great unity at the European level, and start to compete with each other, which would then again raise a lot of questions actually for the institutions just as the European Union. So how do you still create a single market and for this Industry 4.0 not to move us into a world where we start to compete more and more amongst ourselves is a question they should really think about. Then you have the digital divide between countries. Obviously, we take it all for granted sitting in our countries that there is a lot of digital infrastructure. The whole idea that everything being connected to everything, being analyzed and all going smooth is really on the premise that everyone can have access to basic infrastructure. Now, what we know about infrastructure is, one, it's not available everywhere, right? Certainly not if you look at European level. Within countries, it's not available everywhere either. There's hubs where you have it more, and there's a countryside where you might have it less. So there's really a question about which countries are going to thrive, right? And which countries are going to be lagged. And at the European level or at the global level, will this kind of increase the already very strong existing kind of economic disparities between nations? Will we end up in a world where, you know, there's a number of very strong players who drive everything, and the rest of the world becomes kind of the back zone? And who's going to pay for the back zone then, right? How are these transfers going to work? So that's a very important question, certainly if you're the European Commission and you want to make sure you have a unit market where everyone kind of can benefit from can benefit from economic growth at the same time. There's also an issue around infrastructure that actually, although internet and everything is coming broader and wider open, there are a lot of signs that the actual infrastructure that underlines all this is becoming more and more monopolized. And that's been going on for quite a while. So while we have all these open ecosystems and a lot of creation going on, actually the real infrastructure underlying is more and more monopolized. When is this going to start to play a consequence, right? What's happening kind of under the ground, right? And then, of course, there's something else to look at. The more you become digitally connected and dependent from that, now we have already a lot of critical infrastructures in any type of a country, your energy grid, your transportation grids. We've seen a lot of cyber attacks happening in the past months. This is becoming a real reality. If you move your whole industry more and more being connected, obviously this becomes also your strategic a strategic infrastructure. So while before you could maybe look at kind of the industry as being a business problem of them having an infrastructure that kind of holds, the more and more that your economy is actually starting to drive on these type of infrastructures, and this becomes really your economic growth, the more and more it becomes a policy issue or a government issue also to make sure that those type of infrastructures become more and more secured, because they become really strategic infrastructures. So these are kind of the 10 policy areas. And our question is, are we ready, right? There's this beautiful future that might arrive on the basis of manufacturing being completely redesigned with ICT. Great economic growth can emerge from that. There's great levels of innovation. We could be having a lot of new actors there, finally getting served to our own needs. A lot of this production might come back, whether you think that's a good or a bad thing, but it can come back. At the same time, so are we ready to actually stimulate, get us back into a loop where we create really strong economic growth here? And are we ready to manage all the social economic challenges that come from it, right? Will this be inclusive? Will this be, inclusive for people? Will this be inclusive across nations? What are we going to do with our workers, etc.? As you all know, there's a lot of work to be done. Our aim was with this paper and with this work to start to draft some of the questions that need to be addressed actually when people think about policy. And we hope structuring at least the questions, as we say, forward-looking work is very often not to get to the right answers, it's to be able to ask the right questions so we can start thinking about the policies that need to be put in place to create a future that we want and not fall into one that we just have to deal with and react to. So we hope this was useful and opens a bit of reflections. And as I said, I'd love to hear people talk about it over the breaks and give some ideas of how we can solve some of those. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor van der Elst, for your inspiring speech. And well, yes, I have only a couple of notions. I won't keep you from the lunch, so no worries about that. But I think your speech was really inspiring, and your critical notions about the challenges and concerning this development are really important, because, as you pointed out, there are really great expectations and even hype around the Industry 4.0 and the economic growth that would probably follow it. But then, as you mentioned, all those policy areas that really need more work, we could really agree on that there is a lot to do. Because I could argue that we still, as a society, we still largely follow the logic of the first industrial development, and we are now currently living the fourth one. So there is a gap, and it's not a small gap. It's such a really huge gap. But and also following that, I think the most important thing that you mentioned in the beginning is that are the wider societal impacts of this development and the whole societal change that it doesn't concern only the industrial sphere or the economic sphere, but the very basics of the society that we are living. For example, here in Finland, it means the Nordic welfare model, the fundamental elements of it, funding of it, taxation, social security, education system, everything would really need new policies, a lot of changes in order to really fully adopt and live in this new kind of economy and system. But then I've also maybe one thing to add to your policy list. It's already now quite extensive, but one thing I could, and also a question that would follow from that. But then eventually, if we have the capacity and also the will and the investments and the policies made that will lead us towards towards the Industry 4.0 and the economy after that, then I would say that the economies of scale, especially in the digital sphere, they will be really enormous. And for example, investments of the benefits gained from the artificial intelligence investments, that they can be really rapid and radical. So then we can assume that some kind of some level of creative destruction will follow, meaning that some old companies, some old industries, occupations, professions, they will disappear, and then of course new ones will emerge. So if you have any comments on policy making in this for this situation, for creative destruction, or should we, let's say, we could battle against it and we could support the old industries and old ways of working? Yes, I think that's what we are doing now. But we could also accelerate and support this kind of development. And then if we choose to do that, then how could we facilitate the starting of new operations, new companies, and also finding new work and maybe not work in the traditional sense, but a new meaningful activities for individuals, for people. So I think that's maybe one policy area to add to your list. But of course, these are really complex issues, and I think the fourth industrial revolution is more complex than the previous ones, we could say that. So of course the policy making is also more complex, as is the whole conference here will deal with these issues. And also that the Finnish government is also now dealing with these issues. We are preparing the government report on the future related to the future of work. And the first part, I could also maybe advertise a bit. The first part of that report has just been published last week, and we will really go deep into these changes and what needs to be done in the coming year. But I think these are my comments for your really great presentations. Do I have anything else? Okay, one more thing about this value creation. You mentioned how it will be really different in the new economy, and it does not create traditional kind of economic growth, because I think that's one of the assumptions also. And also there is a risk that the new kind of economic growth, it does not provide any more, let's say, traditional jobs and growth, but it will be something else. So that also needs a lot of thinking, but thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm happy to meet you in person, actually.
Yeah, you too, you too.
We've been talking over Skype.
Yes.
No, I don't think you should fight it. If I was the leader of a country, I would think it's going to come anyway. Yeah. So someone is going to figure it out and being able to innovate on the basis of that. So I would certainly take it on as a major opportunity
absolutely.
To grow. The thing is that when you think about growing it and supporting it, it needs a lot of attention. So that's why I think that although we might be far from a tipping point where this, I agree that it might take a while, but if it happens, it's going to be destructive. And not necessarily destructive, as we heard. Destructive is not necessarily a bad word. It creates opportunity. It just takes away what's there, and it creates great opportunities. But it might then suddenly go fast. So that's why I think foresight and thinking about it before it actually happens, to avoid knee-jerk reaction and having kind of to deal with what comes up and to be just reactive is very much needed. So I would be more in the mode of thinking like, well, it's going to happen, it's going to be fantastic. I mean, there's great opportunities, but how can we make it then happen, and how can we put the boundaries on that are actually efficient? So I would certainly go for it. On people and work is obviously the biggest challenge in this whole system, right? What do we do with the people who find themselves to have to be retrained, people who might not have jobs? I think that's the biggest challenge. And there's a lot of discussions, obviously, as you all know, about this minimum income to be provided in certain, I think you and Canada are kind of starting to try out some of those policies. I have very big questions around the success and the usefulness of that, but we can talk about that. I don't see who's going to pay for this, but talking about value creation, I think in a world like that where everything is going to be so interconnected, you can kind of tax away anything you want, like to some kind of an island. And if there's no jobs, you don't have a tax basis anymore. If you think you're going to have your tax basis on the value creation of VAT, companies will find systems to put it somewhere where they tax less. So I think there's a real problem with this minimum income feasibility, but that's just from my knowledge. So yes, I think there has to be a real rethink about how in such an economy, what value is being created. It's not the same as before. What does it mean for your tax base, for how the government actually delivers on its social contract, which currently happens through the tax base, right? You collect, you redistribute. If you don't have anything to collect anymore, how are you going to redistribute? So it's all these type of questions, but I think it's better to start thinking about it earlier than later, and you're one of those countries who actually do think about things in advance, so I wish you all the best.
Absolutely, thank you.
Right, thank you. So Chris Rogers from the UK. Very interesting set of dimensions here. I think what we're now talking about are alternative or different, let's call them business models, but in the very broadest sense, where we identify all forms of value that we then need to create and then find ways of capturing the value and then looking at investment to deliver that value, which couldn't be quite clearly financial or economic investment, but could also be social investment or natural capital investment or whatever. So I think we need to create a different landscape with different sets of business models or alternative business models if we're going to move forward. This is one of the things we've been researching in the UK over the last 5 to 10 years, this idea of alternative business models, particularly for infrastructure or service delivery. But I think that now needs to escalate across the full patch. So fascinating presentations and time to rethink. But obviously Finland is a long way ahead of the game in this, so congratulations to you.
I'll stop asking questions after this, it's not fair. Thank you, Kristel, that was great. Really, really stimulating, thank you. And I tried to link your presentation to the one before with John Casti's. So, looking at these governance structures, I wondered if the current governance structures that you're looking at are unable to deal in an anticipatory way with these fast arriving futures because they're suffering from complexity overload already. And if so, what kind of collapse events in governance you might have considered in your scenario work?
That's a politically very heavy question. Well, obviously, you know, anything which looks like a democracy or has kind of a cycle of a couple of years, it's really hard to do forward-looking thinking. Apart from the fact that then it's also, you know, complexity, and all these organizations work siloed. So they can obviously change that. I mean, there are structures which might be less democratic. I know this is like a taboo topic to talk about too much democracy, not enough democracy, but sometimes long-term planning kind of can benefit from benevolent, like, you know, non-democracies, as we've seen. So that's where a lot of those, I'm not in favor of that, but it's certainly a debate that is coming up, the debate around, like, if we have to adapt to all of these change, do we have the right governance structures in place? And how do we deal with this, like, big structures, democracy? It's a big question coming up, actually. And I think it will depend how it will play out, will depend which types of models can adapt, will survive, will do well, and they will set the role model for the rest of the world. So if some of these more democratic big structures don't start to really well adapt, they might well go into decline to the level where some of them might then disappear, and that might set up kind of this rolling effect. I do believe in this idea that tensions get created, and at certain moments there's moments of truth, right? And you can call it extreme events. It's kind of moments of truth where things start to be set off. And I think our democracy, because I think that's a bit where the democracy or big structures, where you're going, they are under threat for the moment, but it's such a difficult topic to discuss in any of those settings that it's a taboo. And so by consequence, anything which is not strategically discussed on the table might actually happen without, you know, it's dangerous not to talk about all possible futures.
According to OECD report, in OECD countries, automation will replace only about 9% of the workplaces, and in some OECD countries even less. So there is a lot of rubbish talk about automation and the future work. Second point is that I guess in this room, not all people don't know that the revolution of digitalization was about 35 years ago when microcomputers started to go to everything. Now it's a different level, but the real revolution was then. I worked in Kone, we put microprocessors in elevators, and I worked in Nokia where we put microprocessors to everything. So, lot of nonsense talk available.
About the future, we don't know, right? But they can say 9%, and you have other studies which say 50%. Again, even that netting out, like certain people, the general discourse is it's going to be less jobs overall. I know certain people who are going to claim that it's a lot more. You know, if you live in Silicon Valley, you're in cloud computing, you would have a very different perspective on the job creation, because it's just new industries that appear suddenly out of nowhere, creating all those jobs, right? There was no automotive industry, you know, while we were still having horses, right? So it's big questions, yeah. But we don't challenge our assumptions enough, I think. People don't challenge enough assumptions.
Okay, thank you. Anita Sykes-Kelleher from Australia. I've started getting interested in this whole notion of transitioning to this next world of working, and particularly the bogeymen, as I call them, that are coming at us, the things that children fear in the night. So there's two bogeymen I'm looking at the moment. One is automation. Everyone will lose their jobs. The robots are coming, you know, it's like the big fear factor. And the other one is the ageing population. All the old people are coming. They're going to steal all our money. So, and what are we going to do to maintain productivity so that we can keep our social security systems running effectively as we have an ageing population to deal with? So I'm trying to map all these things out and work out where do we start interfering with all of this. Have you done any thinking yourself about this transition? And have you seen any work on the comparison between the transition we're looking at now in the world of work and the transition that happened when we went from agriculture to industrialisation? I've just seen a little bit of work recently that suggests that it's the same sort of scale transition that we're looking at. So I'm just wondering if you've thought about that.
No, I haven't done like any comparison kind of work. I think most of the work is not exactly connecting those dots yet, actually, that you're talking about. A lot of people work in the work, and then how does it go with elderly people and the social security system? But it would be interesting. I haven't seen a lot of work, and if anyone has, I'd love to see it, about bringing all this kind of societal value creation, kind of how the system all works. Because again, on the older people, there's two narratives, right? It's like, oh, all these old people that will not function and deliver anything for our society, and we have to pay for them on top of that, right? So, and they're becoming more and more, and young people won't be working, and, you know, this whole doom scenario, right? On the other side, you have the narrative. You have narratives that talk about, well, these older people will stay more healthy and maybe more productive. And there's a whole service industry that's going to be created around that. So many more jobs again that create. And the nice thing is that all people like to have social contact. So the robots are not going to be able to replace social contacts. So again, there is kind of these big opportunity spaces that are opening up, I think, that with our whole doom scenario way of looking at things for the moment, we might not see. But there's a lot of opportunities there, I think. And if we would switch our mind a little bit more from thinking everything goes wrong, which might not be in this room, but like if we talk to normal people, right? So then usually people think like everything is going wrong and all these things, and that's not a space from which you can create innovation. That's not a space from where you can find solutions and innovate. So it's a mindset problem at some point to find solutions to these issues. Well, if you have the mindset of thinking like, wow, great, okay, a couple of things to manage, but we can start to look at solutions actually. But these big institutions are very much also into more mindsets of like, everything is, you know, they're in danger. And so when you're in danger, you don't really are open to think about kind of how you could shape a better future. You're more reacting to a future. And I think there's a big mindset problem for the moment.
Sure. Thank you, Kristel. Leon Young, Australia. My question is about policy, and it really follows on from Ted's earlier question. Certainly with policy, it seems to be a reactionary reaction from governments, which is really about regime survival more than anything else, more defensive mechanism. And I wonder, given the changes that we're talking about, and we've talked about complexity, whether the government is not the right agent to manage that change. And I just wondered your views on that.
I don't see the government, I mean that's maybe my political views, but the government is not there to create innovation or to create change or to create economic growth. The government is there to put in place frameworks that kind of allow people to create that economic growth and to make sure that they protect their societies, right? So there are frameworks that are. In essence, that's what they should be doing, obviously, but they are in the mindset very often. But I do think that will change. They are still in a mindset for the moment. We just have to look at the elections that are just happening around, right? It's probably where this question comes from. Everyone is defending its own turf and its political party and the current systems and institutions that are in place. However, I think we finally start to see what's been in studies and surveys for such a long time, that people are losing trust in institutions. We've been talking about that since a long time. We start to see very concretely what this means. It means not voting for certain parties. It means not even going to vote. It means the rise of new types of leaders, which we just saw in France. We can see how this plays out, but it's a very different type of leadership. It doesn't come from the institutions, right? So yes, they are defending their turf. I think they are going to very quickly have to wake up to that, and new forces will emerge. And I think that's when change can happen. But they're not responsible for creating growth. That's, for me, people and businesses have to do that. They just have to know where they stop also. Otherwise, we're no longer in then we get to planned economies and these type of things, right? Which is not my political view, but right. So we'll see where it goes. But I do think there is a turnaround that is going on now. I think that system, we're going to get to this extreme event where some of these big institutions are really going to go down, and that's going to create a whole new, different world. We're getting very close to that, I think.
Okay, before we break for lunch, I have a couple of small announcements. So the lobby will serve